We have 4 star speakers today, and it will be my pleasure to introduce them just after I make a few introductory comments. Now, if Professor Hayek, who is a friend of freedom and a mentor to some of the older generation here at this conference, if he were here today, he would remind us why we are here. He'd charge us with the responsibility of defending civilization from imperfect ideas, or as he used to describe it, intellectual error. Then he'd go on to describe what in his mind was civilization, the type of civilization we should be striving for. It's one that he felt that came from spontaneous, voluntary effort from people such as ourselves, and he used to prove how dysfunctional it is when it's a set of rules imposed from above, because it just doesn't work with the human race. He would remind us that civilization is often measured by observing from which countries people flee. They flee from defective civilizations, and they flee to desirable civilizations, a very easy measure, and that's what today's session is all about, measuring. And we use the various indices that have been published around the world to help us measure the success of these policies that we have. My background is engineering, and that's all about measuring results. So I'm pretty passionate about it, and that's probably why I was asked to say a few words. It's the role of think tanks, and we should always remember this, it's the role of think tanks to develop better ideas, to replace the ideas that have got many countries into the difficulties that we see so clearly today. But it's the role of think tanks to develop those ideas on first principles and be very precise about it. It is not the role of think tanks to modify the ideas to make them politically acceptable and politically attractive. That's the job of the politicians. So if we as think tanks start tampering and diluting the policies then get passed on to the political process, and they modify them again. They almost dilute them out of existence, and that's why many policies don't work. We as think tanks must stick with purity, clear ideas, and explain how they will assist humanity in lifting the whole of the human race. We've got to develop the ideas and sell the benefits, and it's these indices that we'll examine today that will enable us to measure the success of these. We use it quite often. For instance, the index of international property rights, we're finding from Mancal that we've found this comparison of last year's, that's the 2014 and the current new one. It shows clearly that Australia, in our case, Australia has dropped from 11th place in property rights index to 12th place. So we're slipping back. So is the US. So without measuring, we're not aware of the problems. We must be aware of the problems so we can solve them. In Australia, we've developed a little book that we call Project Western Australia, which is in the form of an instruction book to incoming governments. So we know the minute they get elected, they'll be too busy kissing babies and focusing on being re-elected. So that's a little instruction book to show them what policies we think will work. And amazing, we've been using a book written by one of our speakers today, Ali Salman, whom I just got to sign it for me, because the policies can be transported country to country, and that's wonderful. Now, the 4 speakers today and their organisations, as explanation, have been receiving a 3-year grant called Levering Indices for Free Enterprise Policy Reform. It's a grant opportunity from Atlas Network to conduct this research and advocacy campaigns and media campaigns to promote these policy reforms. The various indices are the Heritage Foundation and the Fraser Institute and this other property index that I just pointed out to you. This is the first year that this has been done to bring 4 think tanks together to measure the effectiveness, and that feedback goes back to the people that generate these indices, so that next year we'll incorporate the benefits of your research in this one. Now, our first speaker on my right is Tricia Yeo, who's becoming very well known to conference attendees here. Tricia is the Chief Operating Officer for the Institute of Democracy and Economic Affairs here in Malaysia. She was formerly a research officer to the Selangor, to the Chief Minister in the state government and Director for the Centre for Public Policy Studies. She's a regular columnist in The Sun and a movie star on Australian TV recently in the protest street marches that they were doing this. She sits on the Monash University Business School Advisory Board and is co-editor of The Spirit of Merdeka. Editor of The Road to Reform, and author of The States of Reform. She's a recipient of the Meritorious Service Medal referred to by the Selangor Sultan in 2011. Tricia, you've got 15 minutes to tell us your message. And at the conclusion of all the 4 speakers, each have 15 minutes. At the conclusion, we'll have an open question session for all the speakers. Thank you.
Okay, I'll take the mic. Thank you, Ron. It's a very elaborate introduction. Thank you for that.
It's been my
Put that
pleasure.
up. Okay, it's really great to be here. Welcome to KL. I am going to talk to you about our project. Well, all of us here are recipients of this particular grant, where we are actually using an index to measure performance. And our particular project in Ideas is on economic freedom, but a specific part of economic freedom, which is our problems with the freedom from corruption. So measuring corruption. All right, next please. Oh, actually I can use that. Okay, great. So this is what I'm going to be talking about, economic freedom and corruption, and then this particular project, which is called the LIFE project, and how Ideas aims to improve Malaysia's CPI scores, which is the Corruption Perception Index, which I'll tell you about later, the challenges that we currently face, and of course the way forward. This is a pretty long project as far as these sorts of grants go. It's a 3-year long project, so we are aiming at a 3-year goal, which I'll tell you about. So as we know, those of us here who are here in this network are believers in the concept of economic freedom. And there's 2 different indices on economic freedom that are regularly referred to. One is by the Heritage Foundation. And the Heritage Foundation uses these 4 areas to measure economic freedom. I won't go through that. Basically, you've got rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and market openness. Why rule of law is important and contributes to economic freedom? Basically, it ensures that all people within a particular community and society are adhering by the same rules, and all of them have an equal and transparent access to the resources available. Under the rule of law, of course, you've got the issue of property rights and freedom from corruption. So, the relationship between economic freedom and freedom from corruption. This chart actually shows you that countries that had a higher level of economic freedom also were the least corrupt, and vice versa. So the chart actually goes downwards. So countries which were more repressed in terms of its economic freedom levels were also the countries that were the most corrupt. So this tells you that a greater freedom from corruption means greater economic freedom. And I think you can sort of envisage countries and societies where it's corrupt, where people actually have to be politically connected in order to get contracts. Those are the countries in which capitalism actually does not do very well, because there's a commonly phrased term called crony capitalism, which some people might dispute, because they would say that, in fact, capitalism itself should not be called, well, capitalism should be free from cronyism, so therefore crony capitalism should not exist. But that's a different, a more philosophical argument. But over here, what we do believe is that corruption does erode economic freedom by, one, introducing insecurity and uncertainty into economic relationships. Investors coming in will not be able to be assured that when they compete for certain contracts, they will actually be given the same opportunities. It promotes cronyism and bribery. And finally, it decreases public confidence in the market system. So earlier on I talked to you about how we're looking at the Heritage Foundation Index, which includes freedom from corruption, and how this score is calculated is actually taking into consideration the CPI, so the Corruption Perception Index. That's where it draws its data from. And so the CPI is a score of how corrupt a country's public sector is seen to be. This is a particularly well-known index in Malaysia. Every time it comes out annually, there's a lot of newspaper articles about it. It comes out in the media. The government needs to respond to it. And Malaysia does not score very well. We score 50 out of 100, and that's in the most recent CPI in 2015. So there we are over there, 50. See, we do even worse than Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries. Saudi Arabia has been in the news a lot lately as well, those who are following. So for this particular LIFE project, our goals, or the goal is to advocate for reforms in 3 areas: political financing, public-private partnership contracts, and the Malaysia Anti-Corruption Commission. That seems a lot, but I'll go down into the list of why we are focusing on these 3 areas in order to improve, and the aim is to improve the CPI score from 50 to 60 by April 2018. So that's in about 2 years and a bit, and we chose these 3 areas for specific reasons. Okay, so why did we choose these? PPPs, political financing, and MACC. Well, first off, we are actually operating in a very difficult political climate in Malaysia. I'll speak more about it later when I come to challenges. But these are 3 areas that actually are, we believe to be the factors that most contribute to a poor perception of corruption in the country. We chose public-private partnerships because PPPs are actually an area of government procurement. Sorry, this is very technical, just bear with me. PPPs tend to be very, very high-value projects. This is an area where government works directly with private companies. The level of governance is actually lower compared to other contracting requirements under the government. And all decisions that are under PPPs currently actually report right up to the Prime Minister and to the Cabinet, which means that there's not much governance involved. So what we are asking, what our campaign and our project is about, is to push for an adoption of an open tender system, to have public access to PPP contracts, publicly accessible information on all the PPP contracts awarded and implemented. We think that when this happens, that will generate news in the media. The stakeholders and different policymakers, think tankers, academics would actually realize that there is an intent from government to move towards a more transparent regime. Secondly, political financing. This is again something that has come up very much in the news. Political parties in Malaysia are not governed very well. There are no laws, or very, very few laws, that actually state that it is illegal for certain companies to donate. In fact, the only political financing laws that exist in Malaysia govern only the campaigning period in the 2 weeks leading up to the election. There are no laws that govern political financing prior to those 2 weeks of campaigning. And this is actually where a lot of the source of corruption takes place. So what we are also pushing for is for disclosure of political financing for parties and certain regulation on political financing to be passed. And the third area is on reforming of our Anti-Corruption Commission. So recently, again in the news, our MACC has been in the news a lot because a certain person, namely our Prime Minister, has been investigated for a so-called deposit of US $700 million that were deposited into his personal accounts. Actually, I meant to talk about that later, but since I'm talking about the MACC now, the MACC was seen as one of the few government agencies that actually stood its ground because it submitted investigation reports to the Prime Minister, and it has shown some semblance of resistance to the rest of the government institutions, the other institutions meaning the police, the judiciary, and the executive. So this project actually started even before this whole fiasco came about, and this involves our call for the creation of a new, what we would call an Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, an IACC, and also to amend the MACC Act. This involves both constitutional as well as legislative reforms. So if we do get this passed by next year or the following year, this will be a big boost to this project because it means that we've actually gotten the law changed. And finally, separating the Attorney General's roles. This is a very technical aspect of the law, but those of you who are lawyers here will appreciate this. In Malaysia, we actually have a fused body in one. So you have the Attorney General as well as the Office of the Public Prosecutor in one role, which means that the person advised on any criminal prosecution cases is also the same person who is supposed to bring the government to court. And obviously there's a lot of conflict of interest there. Right now it's fused into one, and our project is also to push for separating these two individuals. So as you can see, it's a tall order, but our aim is that by doing these three things, by focusing on these three areas, if the government actually changes those things, changes the laws, or we increase the public demand for those laws, and government is seen to respond well, then we would actually result in an increase of the CPI score. The project has started, of course, and some indicators of success. The PPP contracts, that was in the news a lot because it was carved out from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPPA. And we, of course, jumped into the bandwagon. We released a policy paper on the PPPs in the TPP. It's a bit of an alphabet soup. But all that is to say is that we have put it out there for public discussion. It's actually in the news, in the media. The government has also committed to at least publishing the negotiated contracts on their website. So that is one of the indicators of success so far. In terms of political financing, as I said, we are pushing for, these are a little bit of wrong. Indicators of success. This is what our success would look like. 2 minutes more. Okay, this is what success would look like in 3 years. This would happen, and this would happen. Okay, I talked about it earlier actually. And of course, we want a PR value generated of $100,000 worth by the end of the project. This is an example of some of the campaign and promotion materials that we use. It's a little infographic where we say, fighting corruption in Malaysia, and we have the different points as to how we think corruption can be fought. So we are also going to do things like comic strips, videos, so it will be more of a public campaign. This is the current success. So it's being widely discussed. Ideas has been appointed as part of the government's political financing committee. This was a big win for us because it means that we can really contribute to any laws that are going to be made. And finally, we have support from the MACC itself to reform itself. So that's also a big win for us. And we've got Minister and the Prime Minister's Department being supportive, as well as we've given high-level briefings to political parties and stakeholders, and they are also supportive of the change. These are some examples of our campaign going to Parliament, giving out the papers to members of Parliament, and some high-level briefings. Okay, very quickly, if 1 minute I can talk about the challenges. Our CPI score actually fell from 52 to 50, so that's a big mistake for us to have chosen CPI, but never mind. We actually fell to 50, so we're very worried right now. And our institutions still suffer from a lack of independence. We have a restrictive media environment. Reporting on corruption is actually very limited. We don't have freedom of information. We instead have an Official Secrets Act, and Sedition Act is used regularly to stifle commentary on cases linked to government corruption. Okay, this is the main game changer over here. Okay, we can't run away from this. I'm sorry, Ron. This is, I won't say his name, I am being recorded, but this is the man who has actually partially caused, I believe, the CPI score to fall in the recent year. We've had a lot of scandal in the news about this big case on the 1MDB, and recently there's almost every other day there's actually new news coming out, and the main investigator is actually the Wall Street Journal. I won't go into it so much in detail. So it's going to be a challenge for us. We work with different parts of government. Obviously, some parts of government are more reformist than others. And we work with the parts of government that are trying to reform and change things. The way forward, again, in these three areas, we are still working behind the scenes quite closely. We work by doing all these briefings, as I told you. And we still have to aim to improve the CPI score. The key points to capitalize on would be that the government is actually very sensitive to CPI scores. So after the news came that we fell from 52 to 50, they actually are scrambling, and this is a good chance for us to work with them, and they will seek us out. And secondly, general elections will be held by May 2018. That's 2 years from now. And if the current administration is smart enough, they would have the political will to reform when popular support is required to win. And right now, they know that support is required, especially on the grounds of anti-corruption initiatives. So I think that's all. This is all that we're going to continue doing. And thank you very much. Sorry for the delay, Ron.
Thanks. Thank you, Tricia. We move from Malaysia to India. And Manoj Matthew is the director of the Operations and Outreach Centre of Civil Society in India. He brings 15 years of experience in non-profit leadership and organisational development. He was the former director of programs at CCS. He helped scaling various programs at the centre and advocating policy reforms in the bamboo sector in India. He was the former country manager of Latitude Global Volunteering, an international youth development charity, and he founded Greg Matters, a management consulting initiative providing communication strategy and event management services. Prior to joining CCS, he was the Asian coordinator, then the Secretary General of International Young Catholic Students. He worked in Manila and Paris for 7 years, organising and facilitating programs globally. So, Manoj, let me fix this. You've got them. Over to you.
Thank you, Ron. I'll take the liberty of sitting here and sharing the stories. My main objective of the idea of sharing a couple of things that we do at the center will help you probably to collaborate with us, and secondly, probably you'll have new ideas that we can take back and implement in this project. Let me begin with a small incident that how important it is to be economically free. After staying in a couple of the world cities around the world, I came back to India to work in the think tank CCS, Center for Civil Society, and I wanted to open a bank account. Very simple in 2008. It's not so simple because it required multiple documents, and this is one of the parameters of the ease of doing business, or the World Bank classifies countries on the axis of credit. And it was not possible to open a bank account because I didn't have enough of documentation. And this is a struggle of many Indians that are facing, because they don't have bank accounts that will help them to operate simple things, including starting a small business. One, right?
Yeah.
I'll share this story. This is a man, he's a bank manager in a state bank, in a South Indian bank based in Salem in the southern part of India. He basically acknowledged the same problem I had, that a lot of poor people could not open bank account because they didn't have basic documents. So what he basically did was go around to poor people, making them open the account instead of paying money to the private money lenders or keeping traditionally saving money. This allowed a lot of change in his area. Imagine millions of other people who did not have bank accounts. It is until last year that the government made it simpler by changing the policy that one basic bank documentation can allow you to have a bank account. So it took so many years to change a simple policy to enable people to have access to bank. So what we at the center believe that public policy is very important to create social change. We might have many bankers, many individuals around the country who will be doing smaller actions in pockets, but it requires a policy change that would impact larger things in the country. This led to the project that Ron was referring, what we focus on, the ease of doing business. Lift licenses, lift lives. It took more than 129 days to start business in the country in 2004. It takes roughly around 29 days currently to start a business in India. So, but we do understand that there are a lot of people, now we are not talking about the rich and the powerful, who are kind of liberated by the 1991 reforms in our country, who have access to many things that they can start a business. We're talking about medium enterprises, small enterprises. We're talking about street vendors. We're talking about rural community, people on the streets who are earning their livelihood by either selling things or working for people. So how can their lives be prosperous? So this is a documentation project. It's a project that will enable people to share their experiences and stories, how it is difficult to start a business in the country, and what are the reasons or what are the laws that obstruct your initiative in starting the business. It's a research advocacy project. You can look at the website. It's easeofdoingbusiness.org. It's basically keeping in the parameters of the World Bank, looking at the 10 parameters of ease of doing business, how individuals can open up the business by reducing the laws, or even deleting the laws, or bringing new laws. This leads to, this is our website, which tells you to, which has lots of resources, research done internally as policy briefs, what we call. We also, we want this to be a one-stop website. This is a website in progress. It's functioning, but we are building up, especially the share your experiences. We want entrepreneurs to share their stories through videos, even words, and different ways to communicate what's happening. With this, we also have other projects that we have built in. This is, many of you might know, Jivika Desha Livelihood Documentary Festival, which basically, again, is a platform for all the Asian countries to submit their documentaries on how You have hurdles on prosperity. To capture stories of individuals and communities, how they are facing trouble to be prosperous. So we just had the 12th edition, and every year we get very interesting stories. And stories are powerful ways to communicate. We want the change mindsets of people on the whole simple ideas like to be rich is bad, sometimes thought to be alien, sometimes thought to be bad. So the idea is the documentary festival is a platform to document stories of places that we will not be able to travel in real time. It's also to complement the research work that is done in CCS. We do a lot of research, and often the research papers and booklets turn to be heavy or not accessible. The power of video is more influential, so the documentary festival is a tool also to be a catalyst to promote economic freedom. Last year we launched 5 minutes. Last year we launched one other big initiative. It's also to do with the ease of doing business. It's called EduDoc, Stories of Edupreneurs. Now in our country, and many parts of this world, education is a non-profit thing, so making money out of education is something culturally and politically not to be promoted. But there are thousands of schools owners in our country whose schools are going to be shut off. And they are those edupreneurs we call, who are creating space for education where the state or the public schooling system is not facilitating a place for education. So what we are asking is, go use your mobile phones or any instrument to capture the stories of those individual men and women who have started the schools. So last year, on a pilot mode, we received over 22 documentaries, and we screened a couple of them at the festival. It's just open. If you know anybody around your locality or community who have started a school and is providing education at a very nominal price without all the possible things that the government says. Some of the schools don't have better infrastructure, but the state says you don't have infrastructure, shut it down. What we are saying is that focus on the outcomes of the education. So the EduDoc is one other initiative that we want to engage with a lot of other partners in Asia. We also launched recently, last month, to look back into our journey since 1991. For those who might not be aware, 1991 was the time that India opened the markets and what we call the liberalized economy, when our finance minister then, Manmohan Singh, declared and accepted and presented the budget, which we changed a lot of things by opening the market. And here this is a project again to capture the stories. Many young people don't know what happened in 1991 in India. One of the stories that came in was, first story that came in was from Swaminathan Iyer, who's an economist. Then he wanted to buy a car. It was very difficult to buy a car because the cars were limited in production and the preference were given only to the government officers. There were only 2 production companies in the country. So because of his connections and his government role, he got a car, and because there was not too many cars, he could sell it at a higher price. Even his second-hand car was at a higher price because of the large demand. There are a lot of people who used to wait for telephone line connection because it was monopolized by one state telephone company. There are many, many stories like that. Right now you can walk into any store and get any multiple number of brands of communication. So we want young people to understand what was life in the past, and in the same time, is another 1991 possible, is a reflection that we want to put to the current government, that can we do something drastic and not wait for small little changes? Can we do something big that we can change? So the larger project is called India Before 91. Finally, I just want to conclude by saying the objective of the ease of doing business and the projects that involve with the collaboration with adolescents basically in two things: research and documentation. All work we do, whether it's a documentary festival or a one-pager or a policy brief, is to document. We need to document and share stories, and there's no better way than different tools that the modern world allows us. So use technology to communicate. The second is to advocate of repealing laws. We have a project known as Repealing Laws, which basically looks at laws that are pretty much redundant, alien in the context of today. There are more than over 300 laws plus which needs to be either scrapped completely, which are never practiced or put in place. Ideas have kite. Kite is my favorite outdoor sport, And a law says it's illegal to fly kite in India, but hundreds of people in the country fly kites, but there is a law. Because it obstructs the telecommunication, you had to take permission from the telecommunication to fly kite. And there are many such laws that needs to be changed. So we are promoting probably a day in the country that you change many such laws on a day. So we are promoting the 26th of November, when our constitution was adopted, to be a day to repeal the laws completely over sitting. I don't have to go through the process. These old laws, take a day, repeal the laws. So in a nutshell, we are looking at helping individuals to prosper, small business entrepreneurs to come forward and bring prosperity to them and their families through research and advocacy in the larger spectrum of a complex country like India, where we are facing a lot of challenges, but we are looking for a lot of opportunities with the current government, hopefully doing a lot of things that will help in the transition to a more economically free India. Thank you.
Thank you, Manoj. That was spectacular. Now, I'll move to the other side. It's called moving to the left. Does not reflect on the quality of the speakers, however. Now, we move. Now we've been to Malaysia, India. Now we're going to Nepal. And who better than Arpita Nepal herself, who is the director of the research and development at Samriddhi, the Prosperity Foundation in Nepal. Arpita has been engaged in the freedom movement in Nepal for the last decade. She is a student of economics and specialises in development economics. She has had several articles published in major national dailies. She enjoys classical liberal literature and takes an active interest in translating these into Nepali. Arpita, let me attach this device, and it's all yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ron. I think I've done the presentation a little differently, as in I just have some talking points that I'd like to share with you today. In terms of the session, the larger question I think thrown was, why do indices matter to think tanks like us? And while signing up for this, when we applied for this grant, that's the larger context that I'd like to talk to you about today. Three primary reasons I think that, although Austrians do not necessarily like boiling down everything to numbers, it's three particular reasons that I think it's very useful to actually work on, leveraging these indices that are out there. The first one is our work is so fluid, it's so difficult to show impact. A policy change, as the earlier session speaker argued, it's a long-term project. You're in it for the long haul. Sometimes it's frustrating on two fronts, even on the people who are our supporters and our donors and our partners. For us, it's a difficult job on saying, we're actually making a change. We're doing something about this. Things aren't so bad as it were yesterday. So, that's the nature of the work is so fluid. And so something like an index actually gives us an anchor of measuring our work and saying, look, we've actually made an impact. Somebody's measuring it out there, and we're doing it better, and this is the way we do it better. And therefore, I think having an index to refer to is actually quite important in our line of the work where measuring policy impact is so difficult. The second thing that, particularly in Nepal, is that it's easy sell to all stakeholders. When I say, let's open up markets in Nepal, it would be a huge outcry of saying, what are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? We're a small economy. We need to close, and there are a lot of protectionist tendencies out there. But then if you say, well, in the Doing Business Index, we really need to move upwards so that we can bring in more investment in the economy, more people will be interested in us as a country, our people will become, prosper. And so, it's a much easier sell if I have an index to refer to that I didn't make, that a third party made. It's a supposedly independent, tool in itself. So in our line of the work, I feel that this is, it's become a useful tool for us. So it's not perceived as this is ideologically driven. You're measuring a couple of things, so it's not necessarily perceived that, this is coming from the free market crazy people. The third thing is, I think, once again in my case, it allows, for all of us, it allows cross-country comparisons. And like it or not, bureaucrats are quite competitive, as in there are always those countries where there are political differences that you have. And bureaucrats in general, or especially, you can play on their nationalistic sentiments and say, for us it's India, unfortunately. So it's like India's doing, bureaucrats are really happy when on an index India's doing worse off than Nepal. It's like a big reason to celebrate. And so we're saying, we're doing worse off than India. Come on, we should do something about this. But in general, just doing those cross-country comparisons just for your analytics and saying, something must be going right in this country. It's doing so much better than us. So that is a really useful tool. So in general, I think that's why indices matter in our line of work. Or since I've been involved in this project, it's really come out toward as these. Now there are certain challenges. We picked for our project the Doing Business Index, and we said we would move Nepal on two fronts. One is we would reduce the time and processes associated with starting a business, and the second is we said we'd reduce the time and processes associated with trading across borders. So one of the first challenge is if you follow the Doing Business Index by the World Bank, then you realize that they completely changed the methodology last year. So now we've met our target, literally. So the goals we set out last year, because of the methodology changes, we haven't done anything in Nepal, honestly. We haven't reduced any of the processes. But just because it's measured differently, it suddenly shows up that we're doing really good. And so that's a challenge, because after all, these are indicators. You're trying to measure something, and if that indicator sort of changes, then you've lost your reference point from earlier. So while we spent a lot of last year building all these advocacy materials and campaign materials based on what was last year's index, this year they're no longer relevant, so we have to start all over again. So that's been sort of a challenge. The second thing is, there is always going to be room to argue in terms of indices that they do not reflect the reality. It is true to a certain extent. I myself have been a big critique. So, one of the things, like, for example, in terms of the Doing Business Index on starting a business category, Nepal does much better than India. But if you look where the money is flowing, it's clearly to India, it's not coming to Nepal. So, the reflection of reality is really, truly not there. So, changing something as rigid as an index, which came out of a lot of methodological, conversations and analytical rigor, and they looked at all of those things. Having that reflect reality, we become an average at some point. And so, having that reflect the reality or the unique situation of a particular country is slightly difficult, and therefore, I find that as a challenge. The other thing is, generally with these indices, it's not as, especially with the Doing Business Index, so there aren't representatives of the World Bank in Nepal collecting data on the ground. So communicating that, look, you've got your methodology somewhere wrong over here, and you're not measuring the right thing here, or your information sources are, not giving you the right information, that communication is not very easy to float through. So we still haven't figured out the channel within the bureaucracy of the World Bank on saying, please do something about this, we're not as good as you think we are. So, that's generally my observations on why indices matter, but there are certainly certain challenges in our line of work. What we've been doing about the project is, for us, it's very important to focus on coalition building. And so we've, worked a lot on coalition building. As I told you, our campaign materials are no longer relevant, so we're reworking on them. And finally, if you come from a country like mine, you just have to adapt to unexpected circumstances every single day. Two major ones that came up with us last year was we suffered through an earthquake, and right after that we suffered an unofficial economic blockade from India. And so, that completely changes the conversation within the country. The bureaucrats or the politicians are not necessarily ready to talk about indices and, where we go over there. That's not the priority concern for the country at the moment. And so, you constantly have to adapt if you work in an environment like I do. So yeah, that's based on my experiences. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Peter. Now we move to Islamabad. Ali Salman, the noted author, is the founder and executive director of the Policy Research Institute of Market Economy, known internationally as PRIME. It's a free market think tank, and he's worked as a consultant for major international development organisations, government entities and non-profits. Ali is the author of Price Controls, Implications for Liberty and Welfare, and Discord Between Economic Freedom and Social Justice in Islam. He also writes regular columns for leading English daily, the Express Tribune. He has a master's degree in economics, public policy and business administration. Ali is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs London and alumnus of International Academy of Leadership in Germany. Ali, it's yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ron, for a very generous introduction. I would actually this afternoon talk, I think just like Arpita actually did, not just specific to the projects we are working on in terms of the index, but generally building on my observation on the effectiveness and the limitations of indices as a tool for policy measures, policy measurement. I think in this respect, I'll talk more mostly on the benefits and the challenges which the indices pose. Now, having myself worked on developing 3 different indices in Pakistan over the last few years, I have deeply interested in how indices are actually developed. I developed what is called a Pro-Poor Index, which measured at one point in time how various local governments within Pakistan were allocating their budgets in terms of poverty measure, and how can we rank one local government versus another local government. Sometime later, I also developed a provincial version of the Fraser Institute Economic Freedom Index, in which I introduced certain, some new variables which are more applicable locally in terms of the laws and regulations, which helped to understand the relative performance from one province to another province, and the results were different than what is normally perceived for those who are a little bit aware of Pakistan geography. Punjab, being the largest and more business-friendly province, did not come on the top of that index. It was second, and another smaller province came on the top. Depends how you measure the economic freedom. And then more recently, I had developed what is called a scorecard index to measure the performance of political party vis-a-vis its own electoral promises, by giving out certain numbers to the various aspects of its economic manifesto. So having worked on developing of these indices and scorecards, I think I'd like to generally build on those lessons, the lessons I've learned. But first, I'd like to also share that just like my other fellow panelists here, Prime also got the support of the Atlas Network last year, in which we had started work on one particular part of ease of doing business, which is to do with the contract enforcement. The contract enforcement itself means that, or enforcing contracts more technically, means that how easy or difficult it is for businesses to settle their dispute. So if it takes like a dispute through courts, then definitely there will be a lot of there will be like the contracts would be not as reliable as you would like, and not many people would be encouraged to do investments in a country. So in our project, within the LIFE project, we are focusing to improve Pakistan's position on enforcing contracts through introducing procedural reforms at the courts level and certain administrative measures which can help improve Pakistan's position in enforcing contracts. And we are building on some of the earlier measures which the government has also started doing in terms of setting up certain kind of legal reforms committee. And we believe that if the courts can be convinced of the importance of bringing these reforms, then perhaps not only their own workload can be reduced, but they can be seen as playing an important role in economic development of the country. So making Pakistan a trusted business partner, as we would like to call it, the project. But it's still early days, to be honest, to report something very tangible in terms of the progress. We had made some incremental gains in terms of building liaison with the government, various departments, and we have got a roadmap ready in terms of what needs to be done. We commissioned a few papers in terms of the procedures, but now we're in the process of building more support from various stakeholders to make sure that it actually gets reasonable attention from various within the government level. So that's like a sort of a summary of the project we are working on, enforcing contracts. And now I would like to move to a bigger picture, indices. Why do they matter, and what are their limitations? So I think first of all, indices matter because headlines matter. And when you like to see in a newspaper after the World Bank Ease of Doing Business report that Pakistan fell in position, Pakistan lost a I think last year it lost about 13 ranks. So in terms of the World Bank, it became more difficult to do business. So we were like 124 and we were like 137 right now in terms of ease of doing business. So that was not a good news in terms of where Pakistan stood today, despite of a very pro-business government in place, despite of the fact that this government has a particular history associated with economic reforms, but it did not reflect in how the World Bank perceived the performance on business environment. But then it led to certain serious level of discussion within the government after this recent World Bank report came up, and the finance minister was seen visibly talking about the index and about how can we improve upon Pakistan's position in terms of the business environment. So indices matter because the headlines matter. And then therefore they also get good government attention because the international donors which are present in our countries also would like to project. For example, the World Bank's Pakistan office would like to project their reports vis-a-vis their own contracts and programs with the government, and government is listening to them because they are getting money, financial assistance from them. Indices is also helpful because they would give very quick historical perspective, like snapshots over years, that where we were in year 2005 and where we are in 2010. Though, if as Arpita highlighted, if the methodology changes, then that's a different story. So certainly indices are important. Now, in terms of the limitations of the indices. Now, first of all, how they are developed. For instance, most of the World Bank ease of doing business is built on what is known as experts' opinion. So the World Bank would refer to the report of lawyers and consultants, and based on their experts' opinion would award the report, a particular score to an economy, which may not be reflective of the actual ground reality. Secondly, second problem in the indices, especially where corruption level is so high in such as our societies, then people would actually seek shortcut solutions. And so it might be that, starting business takes in Pakistan 37 days, but if you bribe some official, it actually can take 5 days. So really then Pakistan's official position on ease of starting a business may not be again reflective of the ground reality, and people may not be carrying it a lot of time. And my last point is that the numbers can be actually deceiving. How they are constructed and how these indices are constructed. For instance, the ease of paying taxation. So the ease of, again, paying taxes is one major indicator in the World Bank doing business. But it doesn't say that which direction the taxation policy should be led to. For instance, should it be led to a lower rate or a flatter rate, which we as free market would like to argue. But it doesn't have that sort of a direction for. So say if there is a very efficient way of collecting high taxes, then according to some people, it will still improve the country's position in terms of ease of paying taxes, because it has become more easy to pay higher level of taxation through technology. So these are some of the limitations in which we stand, and because we will like to take a particular position towards the policy change, some of these indicators might not be consistent with our overall policy stance. I think I'll finish it here. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you. We've been privileged to have these insights into the production line of ideas and how they're formulated. I think we've been very privileged to have this insight into the nuts and bolts, how it all comes together. And it's also, it's a tribute not just to our four speakers, but a tribute to the Atlas Network for sponsoring this research so that it can be brought forward as an opportunity for us to look through the window into the think tanks. And we have time. Are there some questions that you would like to direct to any of the speakers? Yeah.
Mike, thank you. It's an interesting session. There's a general question that could be answered by, I guess, any of you. Do you see a difference between quantitative indicators? So if you take the doing business indicator, for example, it has got absolute values, and then it has got ranks. I heard everybody talk only about the ranks. But in actual fact, you could talk about the absolute value as well. So is that more powerful than the kinds of indicators you talked about, which is more qualitative, more story? Did we get this piece of legislation done kind of thing? Number one. Number two, what is the role of media in doing this? Or is there an advantage to the quiet discussions outside the glare of media, depending on what kind of indicators you're working with? And third, what do you do about decision makers who have no sense of shame? Because I work in the whole region, and I try to embarrass some of these guys. And I don't think they know what embarrassment is. In our culture, it's said, you have cut your lajjanahare, that is the particular part of your body that allows you to be ashamed. That some of our decision makers don't actually have it. So 3 questions. Thank you.
These are wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Who would like to kick that off? I think there's meat in there for everybody.
I can start. I don't know if I'd be fully able. Just my thoughts on the subject. With absolute values, the thing about policy, if you're trying to use the index as a policy tool, not as an analysis document, then the comparison, I think, is more important. Because that's what rides on people's sentiments. It's what angers people, or it's what makes people happy. You're being compared with somebody else, and you're either doing better or worse off than them. If it is a real serious discussion on the how do we bring about this change, what goes into this, then the absolute values count. So I don't think it would grab as much of a media attention if we focus simply on the absolute values. I think the comparisons are important. In terms of the role of media, if there is any shame left, they would be extremely useful in building up that, shaming of officials that, we haven't done anything about this. But you're very right. For me, nowadays, I feel like to become a politician in Nepal, you have to have absolutely no sense of dignity, no sense of shame. You cannot survive otherwise. So, you just have to, make completely self-contradictory statements from one day to the other, and it's the same with bureaucrats, or so-called technocrats, who really are. I think they're a bigger burden on us than the politicians. So the role of media is crucial if we want to build the public pressure, and there's something that can be done about this. I see a limited role, but at the same time, I do think just rallying people around and organizing grassroots sort of support on the ideas that you're talking about, definitely the media is important. And that answers the question of your question of shame as well. I don't know how to shame them.
Who else would like to add to that? Ali?
Maybe just brief response on that. The ranks versus score story. Recently, when it was reported the CPI, the corruption index, Pakistan actually improved a couple of points in terms of the scores. So it was received and projected like a great achievement by the government. But then there were like 3 days later, there was a clarification from the Transparency International that how this has been misinterpreted by the government, because in relative sense the improvement was not so great, and when we compared with the other, let's say, South Asian economies. So it was interesting how actually they twisted the numbers.
Thank you.
I think most politicians disagree with any rating, because most ratings are done externally. And most second thing, I think media plays a tremendous role, especially when a country like India is projecting the whole campaign by the current government called Make Media. So the idea is that you need to perform, do better. Regardless of the ranking, the fact is that it is not free in many sense. Your rankings are getting better. India's rank, in fact, got better, but in reality, it doesn't work. One other thing is the rankings do work significantly on other side when think tanks are emphasizing different ways to address to take the ranking up. So we do have success stories what we have done is repealing laws. We have provided to the central government that these are the laws that you need to look at. Around 70% of the laws, they are reconsidering to repeal the laws. Last week, my colleague traveled to the western part, Maharashtra again. We also shared laws. The law secretary and the principal secretary of the state accepted to do something. So there are hopeful, sensible politicians and bureaucrats who might be required to be brought on board. But yeah, I agree with your point. Large number of politicians are not aware because their whole idea is to get themselves elected next. So they don't want to talk into the large economic framework on the ease of doing business. The whole idea is to address the smaller issues that their constituency first needs to be addressed.
Talking about shameless politicians, you have a leader in the country who actually admittedly says that you have political donations from Saudi Arabia during the time of the elections, and that actually does nothing. So how much more shameless can you get? I think in our case, the role of the media is interesting because we do not have free media in the country. You might think that Malaysia is actually some sort of a modern democracy, but we have so many laws that are very repressive. I mentioned some of them earlier. So some parts of the media are important, the online media. In fact, international media is actually proving to be even more important than the local media because the local newspapers are not paying attention to the main issues that matter. So we actually have to turn to other sources to get that. When it comes to the decision makers who have no sense of shame, I think it does help to have some reformist-minded leaders that you can actually go to lobby to. But by and large, we feel that our role still needs to be to incentivize the government or incentivize the policymakers and politicians to tell them how this would actually be beneficial for you, not just in terms of investment and business numbers, but in terms of gaining trust and connecting with the citizens that will allow you to stay in power. I mean, it's a twisted logic, but we all know the reality of it, and ultimately I think that's where the pressure points play into the game. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Trish. Just on that last question, from the Australian point of view, I've noticed that the more scandalised and the more disgraced they are in the newspaper, the happier they are, because they employ staff who measure the success of the politicians by virtue of the number of appearances that they've had in the media. So it ranks them higher in mentions in the media. But what they do hate, they hate being laughed at. So cartoons and jokes are the enemy to bring down corrupt politicians, but it's fascinating. I've watched some of the disgraced politicians and union leaders in Australia. So the news, you read the news, you say, that's the end of them. But they just go on to greater things. So it's a terrible thing, and this has been a most interesting discussion. I think we've been privileged to heard these four magnificent speakers today, and I'd like you to all join, put your hands together